The Duchess. By xxImpressions. Chapter 4. The rest of the dinner continued on in an uneventful fashion for at least another hour. During that time, you and the Viscount conversed on a variety of things. But the overall topic that directed your conversations came about when Anthony asked how it was you spend your free time. After huffing a small laugh, you replied that you were not aware such a concept existed, given that you were the one running all of the estates that used to belong to your late husband. After taking a second to process what you had said, the Viscount came back with a plethora of intrigued questions, since he wanted to understand how you were solely in charge of almost a dozen different profitable estates when he himself could barely manage two. Even with all the education he had received from England's top schools and universities, he often found himself struggling to keep up with the demands asked of him as the head of the household. So to learn that you not only shouldered the same kind of burden, but were also carrying a much heavier load, left him feeling impressed, to say the least. Likewise, you found you two were enjoying the back and forth taking place between you and the Viscount, and had only just placed your finger on why. In your admittedly short marriage, your husband made it very clear that while he wanted you to be seen, he did not expect you to be heard. So to converse with a man who not only knew you had your own thoughts, but also encouraged you to share them was an unexpected, but pleasant surprise. So caught up in your conversation, you both had to hide your visible disappointment when the Duchess of Hastings stood and promptly announced,
"I think it is time we ladies adjourn to the drawing room so the men can linger here over their port."
Light-hearted agreements went around the table as all the women started to stand. The gentlemen began to get more relaxed in their chairs, while servants offered cigars and brandy to those remaining behind. Just before you stood, you felt Lord Bridgerton's touch as he discreetly caught your gloved hand in the movement of it all, while saying in a quiet, but imploring voice,
"Listen to whatever it is my sister tells you, okay?"
You locked eyes and gave an affirmative nod, and it was only then that the Viscount freed you to take your leave with the other exiting ladies. Approaching the drawing room, you saw the Duchess of Hastings was standing at the doorway in order to welcome her guests in as they entered. At least, that is what you thought she was doing until she started to make her way toward you. Momentarily confused, you slowed to a halt once she was about an arm's length away. The other Duchess waited till it was just you and her standing there before saying with a subtle undertone,
"I have heard that you are an avid reader, so I wanted to suggest you take a tour of our library while you are here. It is just through there if you are interested."
Watching as she pointed in a specific direction, you remembered the Viscount's parting words and instantly realized what, or rather who, would be waiting on you should you decide to follow her suggestion. Peeking over your shoulder at the unassuming door for a moment, you turned back unconsciously, wearing an expression of minor uncertainty that soon vanished when the woman in front of you reassuringly said,
"He is only doing this because he cares."
Without needing to specify any names, you both knew who she spoke of, so you had to give her a grateful smile as you decided to dispense with your sudden anxiety by giving her a determined nod and beginning to move. It did not take you long to find the library after you turned in search of it, and shorter still for you to become immersed in browsing through the many titles you saw on the multitude of shelves. However, soon after your arrival, you heard the door to the room open and close in quick succession. Turning to face the entrance, you were not at all surprised to see your once rescuer now standing in front of it. The silence that momentarily surrounded you was broken when the Viscount gestured to the shelves behind you and said,
"I am glad to see that the rumor of you liking books was not false."
Looking at the novels as well, you smiled as you replied,
"Yes, well, a woman must know her own mind these days. And books can be great companions when you have few."
Though you both made attempts at polite smiles following your statement, you each felt a pang when reminded of how lonely your life had been thus far. But in not wanting to dwell on such a thing for too long, you began to make your way toward the couch and casually said,
"Speaking of rumors, I hear that we have actually started one ourselves."
Raising a brow of surprised amusement, the Viscount replied,
"Oh really?"
As you took a seat on the sofa, and he took a seat on a nearby armchair, you responded with more than a hint of humor.
Indeed. It seems this Lady Whistledown has decided we have been secretly courting and has chosen to give her approval.
Chuckling at the absurdity of such an idea, Anthony went on to say,
Well, I suppose that should have been expected, especially after our walk through the park. But that said, she is not the only one to have given her approval of us.
When your mind flashed with intrigue, you curiously asked,
Truly. Who else supports our supposed match?
Smiling once more in your presence, the Viscount explained,
Apparently, my youngest sister. She has decided that my search for a wife should now be over after meeting the person who found her missing ribbon.
Immediately flashing back to the conversation you had all those days ago, you could not hide from your expression that you knew exactly what he was referring to. So with a coy smile, you said,
Oh yes, I remember now. But to be honest, Lord Bridgerton, when your littlest sister proposed marriage between us on your behalf, I never imagined it would be taken seriously.
Finishing with a teasing grin, you watched as one grew on his face as well. Though the smile on his lips was a bit more sly as he replied,
Ah, and therein lies the problem. Seems to me that in this instance, you lacked imagination.
With your jaw dropping as you laughed heartily at his unexpected words, you amiably said in return,
Be rest assured, I can imagine quite a bit, my lord. More than you in fact, since I have actually been married.
The abrupt cutoff was noticeable as you realized you had just broached the one topic you did not like to discuss with the one person you were learning would not let it go. And though you had tried to reel it back in, the damage was already done as the once light atmosphere took a turn and you both proceeded to look anywhere but at the other's gaze when silence caught up to you. This went on until the Viscount patiently looked your way in order to ask,
So, will you finally tell me what is going on?
Your silence continued a little longer than his as you built up the courage to explain all that you had been through. But at some point, you just exhaled a deep sigh, closed your eyes, and resignedly said,
Yes.
And after opening them again, you began to speak.
As you know, I was married off about a year ago. At the time, the only thing I knew about my husband was that he was not a bad man.
Wanting him to understand what you meant, you elaborated on your previous statement while looking at the gloved hands held in your lap.
He was titled, he had an abundance of wealth, and his reputation amongst society was respectable, which meant he was a good man for any young lady to marry.
Unable to hide the bitter smile that grew on your lips, you said,
At least, that is what my aunt told me when she announced our engagement not even 2 weeks after my first formal introduction to him.
The appalled expression now visible on Anthony's face went unnoticed as you continued by saying with a reflective look in your eyes,
And while it is true that he was not necessarily bad, that did not mean he was filled with an abundance of kindness either.
In an attempt to avoid going into the full details, you swallowed before vaguely saying,
I found out on our wedding night just how unkind he could be.
Anthony's eyes dropped to the floor as he quickly deciphered what you were not saying, and you went on speaking in a strong voice.
Before going to sleep that night, I did wish for an escape from the life I was now sentenced to live. But I did not think the fates would answer so swiftly, nor with a life of their own. And yet, the man I had married came down with a fatal fever the very next morning.
Your gaze was now unseeing as your mind flashed back to your husband's last days.
When it became clear that he was not going to make it, he had me send for 2 people, a solicitor so he could get his affairs in order, and his brother since that was all the family he had left in the world.
Suddenly, the look in your eyes hardened.
His younger sibling arrived first in a drunken stupor and heartlessly announced how glad he was that this was happening since he felt it was about time he had a proper inheritance to his name, never mind that it would come at the death of his older brother.
Recalling that cold moment with clarity, you said,
As you can imagine, that did not go over well with the man I married. So when the solicitor showed up after his brother was kicked out, the late Duke immediately had his will changed so that I would inherit when he passed. Since there was a small chance that I had conceived during our wedding night, he wanted everything he owned to go to his potential child rather than his pitiless brother. However, I did not get pregnant. So when he died, I simply remained the Duchess.
Looking at the Viscount, you went on to say,
That is why my once brother-in-law wants to marry me now. If he does, he can reclaim the title and estates he thinks are rightfully his to own. Otherwise, he has to live off his own merits, which has obviously been difficult considering his love of drink. And despite turning him down twice already, he still seems insistent on pursuing me, if only for his own personal gain.
Coming to a close, you concluded your explanation with,
So this, Lord Bridgerton, is what you stumbled upon in the gardens at that ball.
Done recounting your tale, you saw the contemplative expression now resting on his face and allowed him a few moments to process all that you had revealed. Seconds later though, when he turned in his seat to face you, the Viscount's tone was deliberately warm and reassuring when he responded with a slight tentativeness.
So, I believe I have questions.
Placing the ball on how you wanted to answer in your court, he only had to wait a moment in order to hear.
Anne, I believe I have answers.
A small smile grew on your face when your handsome rescuer gave a definitive nod and said,
Good.
while looking your way with his own little grin. And as he did so, you noticed how the smile on his lips radiated one thing, and one thing only. Kindness. End of chapter 4.